At my brother's rehearsal dinner, my mother slipped me a $20 bill and whispered, "Sarah, this should cover your Uber home. You don't need to stay for the family toasts." She had no idea she was dismissing the lead researcher whose groundbreaking lupus treatment had just been approved by the FDA, or that the modest woman she was embarrassing owned more Colorado medical patents than anyone under 40. The inheritance documents in my purse were about to rewrite everything they thought they knew about success, family, and where the real money had been hiding all along. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Dr. Sarah Mitchell, and I'm 32 years old, driving my 8-year-old Honda Civic through the winding mountain roads toward Boulder, Colorado. The afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the Front Range, painting the rocky peaks in shades of amber and rose that should have felt welcoming. Instead, each familiar curve in the highway felt like a countdown to another performance I never auditioned for. After spending the last 6 years building a career in emergency medicine while fighting an autoimmune disease that nearly ended everything before it began, coming home still felt like stepping into someone else's story about my life. The contrast was stark enough to give anyone whiplash. In the hospital, I was Dr. Mitchell, the attending physician who could stabilize trauma patients and publish research papers that changed treatment protocols nationwide. Here, driving past the luxury developments where my mother sold multi-million-dollar homes to tech executives, I was about to become Sarah again. The daughter who was always just a little too tired, a little too serious, a little too focused on unglamorous things like saving lives instead of Instagram-worthy achievements. My phone buzzed against the dashboard mount, and I could see the notification lighting up the screen. Another text from my mother, Patricia Mitchell, whose contact name in my phone still read Mom, despite the years of accumulated disappointment that name represented. The message was typically efficient in its casual cruelty. David's rehearsal dinner is black tie optional. Do you have anything appropriate, or should I see if Jessica has something that might fit? Jessica was my soon-to-be sister-in-law, a social media influencer who made her living photographing her breakfast and possessed the kind of effortless beauty that my mother had always wished I could manage. She was also about 4 inches taller and 2 dress sizes smaller than me, but my mother's capacity for willful blindness about logistics had always been impressive when it served her narrative. I didn't respond to the text. There wasn't really an appropriate response to being asked if I owned adult clothing suitable for formal occasions. Instead, I focused on the road and tried to remember why I'd agreed to come home for this celebration in the first place. The answer, unfortunately, was the same reason I'd been making these painful pilgrimages for years. Some part of me, the part that remembered being 7 years old and believing that love was supposed to be unconditional, kept hoping that something would change. The Mitchell family home came into view as I crested the hill on Mapleton Avenue, and it was exactly as imposing as I remembered. The Tudor-style mansion sat like a monument to successful suburban achievement, its perfectly manicured lawn stretching toward the street like a green carpet, announcing the financial stability of its inhabitants. My father's Mercedes and my mother's BMW were parked in the circular driveway, bracketing the space where David's new Tesla would normally sit. Tonight, he was probably staying at the St. Julian Hotel with Jessica and her wedding party, living in the luxury bubble that had been their home base for the past week of festivities. I parked on the street, as had become my custom during family visits. The driveway felt like a stage set for a play I wasn't cast in, and I'd learned that small acts of self-preservation could add up to something that resembled dignity, if you were careful about it. Walking up the familiar stone path, I noticed new additions to the landscape design. Someone, probably my mother, had installed solar lights along the walkway and commissioned a new planting of seasonal flowers that must have cost more than most people's monthly rent. The Mitchell family home had always been a showcase, but the renovations seemed more aggressive now, as if the house itself was competing in some neighborhood affluence contest. I used my key to let myself in, a privilege that somehow always felt more like a test than a welcome. The foyer opened up into the grand staircase, and the smell hit me immediately. It was my mother's signature scent. A combination of expensive candles, fresh flowers, and the particular kind of cleanliness that could only be achieved by people who paid other people to achieve it. Everything gleamed. The marble floors reflected the light from the chandelier like still water, and not a single item was out of place. It was beautiful in the way that museums are beautiful, and about as warm. "Sarah?" My mother's voice floated down from the second floor, carrying that particular tone of mild surprise she reserved for my arrivals, as if my showing up to my own brother's wedding weekend was an unexpected development that required some adjustment to her carefully laid plans. "I didn't hear your car." "I parked on the street," I called back, hanging my jacket in the closet and noting that the space I'd always used was now occupied by several of Jessica's designer coats. Apparently, my closet space was also black tie optional. Patricia Mitchell appeared at the top of the stairs, and she looked exactly like the successful real estate agent she was. Her blonde hair was professionally styled in the kind of casual waves that required significant time and money to achieve. She wore a silk blouse and tailored pants that probably cost more than I spent on clothes in a year. And her jewelry was understated in the way that only truly expensive pieces could manage. She was 58, but could have passed for 45, thanks to the kind of maintenance routine that was available to women in her income bracket. "Oh, good," she said, descending the stairs with the careful grace of someone who knew she looked good doing it. "I was worried about timing. The rehearsal dinner starts at 7, and I know you don't usually—" She gestured vaguely at my jeans and sweater, letting the sentence hang in the air like a question that didn't need to be asked. This was the dance we'd perfected over the years. My mother would identify some area where I fell short of expectations, but she'd do it gently, with concern rather than criticism, as if my failures were medical conditions that required sympathy.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Rather than judgment, it was more effective than outright hostility because it made me complicit in my own diminishment. How could I argue with someone who was only trying to help? "I brought something to change into," I said, which was true. I'd packed a simple black dress that would meet the technical requirements of the occasion without drawing attention or requiring commentary. "Perfect," she smiled. And for just a moment, I could see the mother I remembered from childhood. The one who had braided my hair before school and made elaborate birthday cakes shaped like whatever cartoon character I was obsessed with that year. "David is so excited to have everyone together. This whole week has been like a dream for him." The dream had cost $2.3 million, according to the number I'd overheard my father mentioning to his golf buddy last month. Not that anyone was supposed to be keeping track, but when you've spent the last 5 years watching every dollar disappear into medical bills and prescription co-payments, other people's casual relationship with large amounts of money tends to catch your attention. My brother's wedding wasn't just an event, it was a statement. 3 days at Boulder's most exclusive resort, with guest accommodations, spa treatments, and activities planned for everyone in the wedding party and their families. The rehearsal dinner alone was costing more than I made in 2 months. But David deserved the best. He'd always deserved the best, according to the family mythology that had shaped our childhood and apparently continued to govern our adult relationships. I made appropriate noises about David's happiness and Jessica's beauty, and my mother launched into a detailed recap of the week's events so far. The couples massage she'd arranged for the wedding party, the private wine tasting that had been absolutely magical, the photographer who was worth every penny, despite costing more than some people's cars. She spoke with the enthusiasm of someone describing a vacation in paradise, which, from her perspective, it probably was. What she didn't mention, because it had never occurred to her to mention it, was that I hadn't been invited to any of these pre-wedding celebrations. The wine tasting, the spa day, the private dinners that had been happening all week. I was invited to the rehearsal dinner and the wedding itself, but the intimate family bonding experiences were apparently reserved for people who fit more naturally into the aesthetic my mother was trying to create. I listened and nodded and made encouraging sounds and tried to ignore the familiar ache that had nothing to do with my autoimmune condition. This was the price of admission to my own family, and I'd been paying it for so long that I'd almost forgotten there might be another way to exist in relationship to these people. My father appeared in the doorway of his study, and his face lit up with genuine warmth when he saw me. Robert Mitchell was 61 years old and looked exactly like what Central Casting would order if they needed someone to play a successful insurance executive. He was tall and still handsome, with silver hair and the kind of confidence that came from decades of making good decisions about other people's money. He'd built his career on understanding risk assessment, and he'd applied those same skills to building a comfortable life for his family. "There she is," he said, crossing the foyer to give me a hug that felt real. My father's affection had always been more straightforward than my mother's, less complicated by disappointment or unmet expectations. He was proud of me for becoming a doctor, even if he didn't entirely understand why I'd chosen emergency medicine over something more prestigious and lucrative like plastic surgery or cardiology. "How's the hospital treating you? Still saving lives and taking names?" It was a dad joke, the kind of gentle teasing that had characterized our relationship since I was old enough to have career ambitions. He'd never quite grasped the specifics of what I did, but he understood that it was important and difficult, and that was enough for him. It was more understanding than I got from anyone else in the family, so I treasured it accordingly. "Something like that," I said, accepting the hug and appreciating the momentary, uncomplicated warmth of it. "Congratulations on the wedding. David seems really happy." "He is. They both are. It's going to be quite the celebration." He glanced at my mother, and something passed between them, some communication that I wasn't privy to. "We should probably start getting ready soon. Traffic up to the resort can be unpredictable on weekends." The resort. The St. Julian Hotel and Spa, where David and Jessica would be married tomorrow, in a ceremony that would be photographed by professionals and shared across social media platforms to document their perfect love story. The venue that cost more per night than I made in a week, where the family would gather to celebrate the golden couple and their bright future together. I went upstairs to change, walking past the family photos that lined the hallway walls. My parents had redecorated since my last visit, and the new frames contained images from the last few years of family celebrations. David's graduation from business school, his promotion to marketing director, his engagement party at the country club. Jessica's influence was visible in the composition and styling of the photos. Everything looked professional, coordinated, like spreads from a lifestyle magazine. I paused in front of one particular photo, taken at David's engagement party 6 months ago. Everyone was gathered around the happy couple, glasses raised in a toast, faces glowing with celebration and expensive lighting. I was in the photo, standing slightly behind and to the left, wearing a simple dress that looked appropriately festive but unremarkable. What struck me wasn't my own presence, but my expression. I looked tired, and not just physically, I looked like someone who was trying very hard to appear happy about something that was costing her more energy than she could afford to spend. My childhood bedroom had been converted into a guest room years ago, but my mother still referred to it as Sarah's room, in the same way she might reference a historical landmark. The furniture was different, the color scheme updated to something more sophisticated than the purple and white motif I'd chosen when I was 12. But the bones of the space were the same, and being there still triggered muscle memory of homework struggles and teenage heartbreaks, and the particular loneliness of being the family member who never quite fit the template. I changed into the black dress I'd brought, applied minimal makeup, and stared at myself in the mirror. The dress was appropriate and unremarkable, exactly what I'd intended. It would allow me to blend into the background of whatever tableau my mother had orchestrated for the evening, to play my assigned role without drawing unwanted attention or commentary. I looked like exactly what I was, a woman who had learned to make herself smaller in order to fit into spaces that weren't designed for her. The drive to the St. Julian Hotel took 20 minutes through Boulder's picturesque downtown, past the Pearl Street Mall where I'd spent teenage weekends window shopping, and the coffee houses where I'd studied for the MCAT. Everything looked prosperous and carefully maintained, like a movie set designed to represent the American dream, which in many ways it was. Boulder had always been a place where money could buy not just comfort, but the appearance of virtue, where expensive organic food and sustainable architecture created the illusion of moral superiority alongside material success. The hotel itself was exactly what I'd expected. Elegant without being ostentatious, expensive in the way that whispered rather than shouted. The kind of place where wealthy people gathered to celebrate life's major milestones in settings that would photograph beautifully and create the kinds of memories that could be displayed proudly for years to come. The rehearsal dinner was being held in a private dining room that overlooked the mountains, and as I walked into the space, I was struck by how perfectly choreographed everything looked. Round tables with white linens and seasonal centerpieces, soft lighting that made everyone look like they were starring in their own romantic comedy, a string quartet playing background music that suggested sophistication without demanding attention. And there, in the center of it all, were David and Jessica, holding court like the royalty they'd become for this weekend. David looked handsome and confident in his tailored suit, his dark hair perfectly styled, his smile wide and genuine. He had always been the kind of person who looked comfortable in formal situations, who could wear expensive clothes and make them look effortless rather than costume-like. Jessica was radiant in the way that people describe brides, wearing a dress that probably cost more than my monthly salary and jewelry that caught the light whenever she moved. She had the kind of beauty that photographs well and the personality to match, bubbly and charming and naturally suited to being the center of attention. They made a beautiful couple, and their happiness was evident and infectious, which made what happened next even more jarring. I approached their table to offer congratulations, and Jessica's face lit up with what appeared to be genuine pleasure. "Sarah, I'm so glad you could make it. You look lovely." She stood to give me a hug, and her warmth seemed authentic, unforced. David's greeting was more reserved, but still friendly. "Hey, sis, thanks for coming. I know you're always busy at the hospital." There was no criticism in his voice, just acknowledgement of what he understood to be my reality. We chatted for a few minutes about the wedding plans, the venue, the weather forecast for tomorrow's ceremony. Normal family conversation, the kind that could happen at any celebration anywhere. I was starting to relax, to remember why I loved these people despite everything, when my mother appeared at my elbow. "Sarah, honey," she said, her voice carrying that particular combination of affection and gentle correction that I knew so well. "I think there might be some confusion about the seating chart. You're actually at table 12 near the back. I know it's not ideal, but we had to make some last-minute adjustments for Jessica's family." Table 12 was indeed near the back of the room, close to the kitchen doors and far from the head table where the immediate family was seated. It was the kind of placement that communicated status as clearly as any announcement, and everyone in the room would understand exactly what it meant. But what made the moment truly painful wasn't the table assignment itself. It was the way Jessica's expression changed when she realized what was happening. The genuine warmth in her eyes shifted to something that looked like confusion, then embarrassment, then a kind of protective concern that I wasn't sure how to interpret. "Oh," Jessica said, and I could hear her trying to navigate the social minefield that had just opened up beneath our pleasant conversation. "But Sarah's immediate family, shouldn't she be—" "It's fine," I said quickly, before my mother could explain the complicated logistics that had somehow necessitated separating me from my own family at my own brother's rehearsal dinner. "Table 12 is perfect. I like having a view of the whole room." And that is how I found myself spending my brother's rehearsal dinner at a table full of Jessica's college friends, lovely women who included me in their conversation and seemed genuinely confused about why the groom's sister was sitting with them instead of with her family. I watched from a distance as toasts were made and stories were shared, and David and Jessica were celebrated by the people who mattered most to them. The speeches were beautiful. My father spoke about watching David grow into the kind of man he was proud to call his son. My mother shared memories of David's childhood that painted him as curious and kind and destined for exactly this kind of happiness. Jessica's parents welcomed David into their family with warmth and obvious affection. No one mentioned me. No one told stories about David's relationship with his sister, or shared memories that included both of us, or acknowledged that he had a family beyond the parents who had produced him. It was as if I existed in some parallel dimension that occasionally intersected with theirs, but didn't warrant inclusion in the official narrative of his life. When the evening finally wound down, I hugged David and Jessica goodbye and promised to see them tomorrow at the ceremony. My mother was busy coordinating logistics with the wedding planner, and my father was settling the bill with the kind of casual authority that suggested this level of expense was routine rather than exceptional. I found myself alone by the coat check, waiting for the valet to bring my car around, when Jessica appeared at my side. She changed out of her dinner dress into more casual clothes, and she looked younger and less polished than she had during the celebration. "Sarah," she said, and there was something in her voice that made me pay attention in a way I hadn't all evening. "I wanted to apologize for the seating thing. I had no idea that was going to happen." "It's okay," I said automatically, because that was always my response to these situations. It wasn't okay, but making it not okay would require confronting people who had the power to make future family gatherings even more uncomfortable than they already were. "It's not okay," Jessica said firmly. "You're David's sister. You should have been at our table, or at least with your parents. I don't understand why."
She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "I don't understand why your family treats you like you're not really part of it." The observation was so accurate and so unexpected that it took my breath away for a moment. Jessica was an outsider to our family dynamics, which meant she could see things that had become invisible to those of us who had been living with them for years. And what she saw was the truth that I'd been trying not to acknowledge. I wasn't really part of this family in any way that mattered. "It's complicated," I said, which was the response I'd perfected for situations when the truth was too large and too painful to explain to someone who hadn't lived it. "Is it?" Jessica asked, and her directness surprised me, because from where I'm sitting, it looks pretty simple. You're a doctor, you save people's lives, you've never caused any family drama that I know of, but your parents treat you like you're some kind of problem that needs to be managed rather than celebrated? Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with a text message. The notification preview showed it was from my mother. "Sarah, can you take an Uber home tonight? Your father and I are staying at the hotel and we'll need the extra parking space for tomorrow's vendors." I stared at the message for a long moment, trying to process the layers of dismissal it contained. They hadn't mentioned staying at the hotel. They hadn't asked if I needed a ride or had alternative transportation arranged. They'd simply informed me that my presence was inconvenient and expected me to solve the problem myself. Jessica was reading over my shoulder, and I watched her expression change from confusion to something that looked like anger. "Are you kidding me?" she said loud enough that a few other people turned to look at us. "They're asking you to take an Uber from your brother's rehearsal dinner?" "It's fine," I said again, but the words sounded hollow even to me. "No, it's not." Jessica pulled out her phone and started typing something. "David and I are staying here tonight too, but we have a suite with 2 bedrooms. You should stay with us." The offer was generous and unexpected, and it highlighted the kindness that I wasn't receiving from my own family. but accepting it would mean admitting that I needed rescue from my own parents, and that felt like crossing a line I wasn't ready to cross. "Thank you," I said, "but I think I'll just head home. It's been a long day." Jessica looked like she wanted to argue, but she seemed to understand that pushing the issue would only make things more uncomfortable. "Okay," she said, "but Sarah, tomorrow at the wedding, you're sitting with us. I don't care what your mother's seating chart says, you're family, and you should be treated like family." I thanked her and meant it, then waited outside for my rideshare driver and tried not to think too hard about the fact that my soon-to-be sister-in-law had shown me more consideration in one evening than my parents had managed in months. The Uber ride home took me back through downtown Boulder, past all the familiar landmarks of my childhood and adolescence, the bookstore where I'd discovered my love of science, the restaurant where my family had celebrated my acceptance to medical school, the park where I'd played as a child before I understood that love was supposed to be conditional on meeting expectations I'd never fully understood. As we drove through the quiet residential streets toward my parents' house, I found myself thinking about Jessica's question. Was it really that complicated? Or was the truth exactly as simple as she'd suggested? I was a problem to be managed rather than a daughter to be celebrated. My phone buzzed with another text, and for a moment I hoped it might be my parents checking to make sure I'd gotten home safely. Instead, it was a notification from the medical journal that had published my latest research paper. Someone had cited my work in their own study, and they wanted to thank me for the contribution to the field. I stared at the message, and something shifted inside me. Here was proof, delivered at exactly the moment I needed it, that my work mattered to people who understood its value. Somewhere in the world, other doctors were using my research to treat patients, to save lives, to advance medical knowledge in ways that would ripple outward for years to come. My family might not understand what I did or why it mattered, but the rest of the world did. The question was whether I was going to keep letting their blindness define how I saw myself, or whether I was finally ready to stop performing in their play and start writing my own story. The morning of David's wedding arrived with the kind of crystalline mountain sunshine that made Boulder look like a postcard advertising the good life. I woke up in what used to be my childhood bedroom, now redecorated in neutral tones that suggested expensive hotels rather than family memories, and listened to the sounds of preparation echoing through the house below. Caterers were arriving early to coordinate with the venue, florists were delivering last-minute arrangements, and my mother's voice carried up the stairs as she orchestrated the morning's logistics with the precision of a military operation. I lay in bed for an extra few minutes, staring at the ceiling and trying to summon the energy required to participate in what promised to be an emotionally exhausting day. My lupus had been relatively quiet lately, thanks to the expensive biological medications that were slowly bankrupting me, but stress had a way of triggering flares that could leave me feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. Today felt like the kind of day that would test every coping mechanism I'd developed over the past 5 years of managing a chronic illness while building a demanding career. The irony wasn't lost on me that I spent my days treating other people's medical emergencies while struggling to afford my own health care. Emergency medicine paid well compared to most careers, but not well enough to comfortably absorb the ongoing costs of a chronic autoimmune condition. The biologics alone cost $3,000 per month, even with insurance, and that didn't include the regular specialist appointments, blood work, and occasional hospitalizations that came with keeping lupus under control. I'd done the math more times than I'd cared to admit. The money my parents were spending on David's wedding could have covered my medical expenses for the next 12 years. It could have eliminated the credit card debt I'd accumulated during medical school and residency when I was too sick to work extra shifts. It could have bought me the kind of financial security that would let me focus on my patients and my research without the constant underlying anxiety about whether I could afford to stay healthy enough to keep working. But that kind of thinking was a luxury I couldn't afford either. Resentment was an emotion that required energy I needed for other things, and I'd learned to redirect those thoughts toward more productive channels. Like the research project I'd been working on for the past 3 years.
developing new treatment protocols for lupus patients that could potentially help thousands of people avoid the financial and physical struggles I'd been navigating. My phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Elena Rodriguez, my mentor and the chief of medicine at Boulder Community Hospital. Elena was the kind of physician I aspired to become: brilliant, compassionate, and uncompromising in her commitment to both patient care and medical advancement. She'd been instrumental in supporting my research and had become something of a surrogate parent figure during the years when my actual parents were too busy with David's achievements to pay attention to mine. The message was brief but encouraging. Sarah, just saw the preliminary results from the Phase 2 trials. Extraordinary work. Can't wait to discuss the publication timeline when you're back. Enjoy your brother's wedding. Even Elena, who knew more about my family dynamics than most people, assumed that I would be enjoying today's celebration. It was a reasonable assumption. Brothers getting married should be occasions for joy and connection, opportunities to strengthen family bonds and create lasting memories. The fact that it felt more like an endurance test said more about my family than it did about weddings in general. I showered and dressed carefully, choosing a navy blue dress that struck the right balance between formal and unremarkable. It was expensive enough to meet my mother's standards, but conservative enough to avoid drawing attention away from Jessica, who would rightfully be the center of attention today. I'd learned to dress defensively for family events, selecting clothes that couldn't be criticized for being too casual or too flashy, too cheap or too extravagant. Downstairs, the house had been transformed into a staging area for the day's events. My mother was in full coordinator mode, wearing a pale pink dress that probably cost more than I made in a month, her hair and makeup professionally done despite the early hour. She moved through the space with the confidence of someone who knew she looked perfect and was orchestrating an event that would reflect well on the family's status and taste. My father sat at the kitchen island with his coffee and the morning paper, dressed in the kind of expensive casual wear that suggested he had important places to be later. He looked up when I entered the room, and his smile was warm and genuine, untainted by the complicated expectations that characterized my interactions with my mother. "Morning, sweetheart," he said, folding the financial section of the Denver Post. "Big day today. You excited?" It was such a normal dad question, asked with such uncomplicated affection, that I felt a pang of sadness for the relationship we might have had if family dynamics weren't so heavily influenced by my mother's particular vision of what success looked like. My father had always been proud of my medical career. Even if he didn't fully understand the specifics of what I did, he bragged about me to his golf buddies and asked thoughtful questions about my work. And he seemed genuinely puzzled by my mother's tendency to minimize my achievements. "Very excited," I said, accepting the cup of coffee he poured for me. "David seems really happy." "He is. They both are." He glanced toward the living room where my mother was directing the placement of additional floral arrangements. "Your mother's been working on this for months. She wants everything to be perfect." The wedding had indeed been months in the planning, and the attention to detail was evident in every element of the celebration. My mother had approached David's wedding with the same focused intensity she brought to her most important real estate deals, researching vendors, negotiating contracts, and coordinating logistics with the precision of someone who understood that reputation and social standing were built through the accumulation of perfectly executed details. What struck me wasn't the effort itself, but the contrast with how my achievements had been acknowledged over the years. When I'd graduated from medical school, there had been a small family dinner at a nice restaurant. When I'd completed my residency, my parents had sent flowers to the hospital. When I'd been accepted for my current position in Boulder, my mother had mentioned it briefly to her friends as evidence that I was finally settling down somewhere respectable. None of these moments had warranted the kind of celebration that was happening today. And I understood why. Medical school graduation was an accomplishment, but it was also expected. I'd announced my intention to become a doctor when I was 12 years old, and everyone had assumed I would follow through because that's what serious, studious children did. There was no surprise in my success, no narrative arc that made for interesting conversation at cocktail parties. David's engagement and wedding, on the other hand, represented the kind of life milestone that could be shared and celebrated publicly. Marriage was universally understood as an achievement worth commemorating. And Jessica's beauty and social media presence made her the kind of daughter-in-law that reflected well on the family's judgment and good fortune. I was still processing these thoughts when my mother appeared in the kitchen doorway, her expressions suggesting that she discovered some detail that required immediate attention. "Sarah, honey," and I could hear the carefully modulated tone that usually preceded a request disguised as a suggestion. "I just got off the phone with the wedding planner, and there's been a small change to the transportation arrangements. The family car service is completely booked with the wedding party, so you'll need to drive yourself to the ceremony." This was presented as a minor logistical adjustment, but I understood the subtext immediately. The family car service was transporting the people that mattered most to today's celebration: the bride, the groom, their parents, the maid of honor, and the best man. I was not included in that group, despite being the groom's only sibling. "Of course," I said, because there was really no other acceptable response. "What time should I arrive?" "The ceremony starts at 4, so maybe 3:30. That should give you time to find parking and get settled before the processional begins." My father looked confused by this exchange, and I could see him trying to work out why his daughter was being excluded from the family transportation arrangements. But my mother was already moving on to the next item on her extensive to-do list, and the moment for questions had passed. I spent the morning helping with various small tasks around the house, arranging flowers, organizing gift bags for out-of-town guests, and generally making myself useful while staying out of the way of the more important preparations. It was familiar territory, this role of helpful but peripheral family member, and I'd learned to find satisfaction in the quiet competence I could bring to these situations. Around noon, David appeared at the front door with his groomsmen, looking handsome and slightly overwhelmed by the magnitude of the day ahead. He was wearing a casual version of his wedding outfit, and his hair was styled with the kind of careful casualness that suggested professional intervention. He looked like a man who was about to marry the woman of his dreams in front of everyone he cared about, which was exactly what he was. "Hey, Mom," he said, accepting a hug from her mother that was careful not to disturb her hair or makeup. "Everything looks incredible. Jessica's going to love the flowers." "I hope so," my mother replied, but her tone suggested confidence rather than worry. "I think we've managed to create something really special." David turned to me with the kind of smile that reminded me why I loved him despite everything else. "Sarah, I'm so glad you're here. Thanks for helping with all of this." "Wouldn't miss it," I said, hugging him carefully to avoid wrinkling his shirt. "You look happy." "I am, really happy." He paused and something shifted in his expression. "Hey, I wanted to ask you something. Jessica mentioned that there was some confusion about seating last night. She seemed upset about it." I felt my mother's attention sharpen, even though she was pretending to be focused on arranging gift bags across the room. This was potentially dangerous territory, a conversation that could either clear the air or make future family gatherings even more complicated than they already were. "It wasn't a big deal," I said carefully. "I ended up at a table with Jessica's college friends, and they were lovely." "But you should have been with family," David said, and there was something in his voice that suggested he was genuinely troubled by what had happened. "I mean, you're my sister. You should have been at our table." This was the moment when I could have chosen to explain exactly why I'd been seated with acquaintances rather than family, could have detailed the subtle ways I'd been excluded from the intimate celebrations throughout the week, could have asked why my presence seemed to be viewed as a logistical problem rather than a source of joy. Instead, I chose the path I always chose, the one that preserved family harmony at the expense of my own feelings. "The important thing is that you and Jessica had a wonderful evening. That's what matters." David looked like he wanted to pursue the conversation further, but my mother chose that moment to insert herself back into our interaction. "David, honey, you should probably get going," she said, checking her phone for the time. "The photographer wants to start the getting ready shots at the hotel in an hour, and Jessica will be expecting you." "Right," David said, but he was still looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Sarah, I'll see you at the ceremony?" "Of course," I said. "I'll be there." After David left with his groomsmen, the house settled into a different rhythm. The major preparations were complete, and now it was just a matter of final touches and getting everyone ready for the main event. I helped my mother with her jewelry, zipped her dress, and listened to her run through the timeline of the afternoon's activities one more time. She looked beautiful. There was no denying that. The pale pink dress was perfectly fitted, her hair and makeup were flawless, and she wore the kind of confidence that came from knowing she had orchestrated something that would be remembered and talked about for years to come. This was her moment as much as it was David and Jessica's, the culmination of months of planning and the public demonstration of her family's success and good taste. "You look stunning," I told her, and I meant it. "Thank you, sweetheart," she replied, and for a moment her expression softened into something that looked like genuine maternal affection. "I want everything to be perfect for David." "It will be," I assured her, and I believed it. Whatever else could be said about my mother, she had never failed to deliver on her promises when it came to creating memorable occasions. My father appeared at the top of the stairs, looking distinguished in his formal suit, and the three of us stood together in front of the hallway mirror for a moment. We looked like what we were, a successful, attractive family dressed for an important celebration. The image was picture perfect, and I understood that maintaining that image was more important than addressing the underlying dynamics that made it feel hollow to me. "Beautiful family," my father said, and he sounded genuinely moved by the sight of us together. "We should go," my mother said, checking her phone again. "I don't want to be late for the photos." This was when I learned that "we" didn't include me. The family photos were being taken at the hotel before the ceremony, and apparently my presence wasn't required for those either. My parents would be photographed with David and Jessica, creating the official record of this milestone moment, and I would meet them at the ceremony venue. "Sarah, you'll come directly to the chapel?" my mother asked, as if this arrangement was so obvious it barely needed to be confirmed. "Yes," I said, because what else was there to say? I watched them leave, my father helping my mother into his Mercedes with the kind of old-fashioned courtesy that had characterized their marriage for 35 years. And I felt the familiar sensation of being simultaneously part of this family and completely separate from it. Alone in the house for the first time all day, I sat down in the living room and allowed myself a few minutes to process the emotions I'd been suppressing since I'd arrived the day before. The hurt, the confusion, the growing awareness that my role in this family was fundamentally different from what I'd always assumed it was. My phone rang, and I was surprised to see Elena Rodriguez's name on the caller ID. It was Saturday afternoon, and she rarely called unless there was a medical emergency that required my input. "Elena?" I asked. "Is everything okay at the hospital?" "Everything's fine," she said, and I could hear something unusual in her voice, a kind of excitement that she rarely displayed. "Sarah, I'm sorry to call you on your family day, but I just got off the phone with Dr. Marcus Webb at the Mayo Clinic." Dr. Marcus Webb was the head of rheumatology at Mayo, one of the most respected medical institutions in the country. I'd met him briefly at a conference the year before, but I couldn't imagine why he would be calling Elena about me. "What about?" I asked. "He read your latest paper on lupus treatment protocols, and he wants to offer you a position. Not just a position, Sarah. He wants to offer you directorship."
Any position, Sarah. He wants you to head up a new research division focused on autoimmune disorders. Full funding for your research, a team of junior researchers, and a salary that... She paused, and I could hear papers rustling. "Sarah, he's offering you $450,000 a year, plus research funding and benefits that would make your current medical expenses irrelevant." I felt like someone had just told me I'd won the lottery. The Mayo Clinic was the kind of institution where careers were made, where the most important medical research in the world was conducted. To be offered a department head position at my age with full funding for research was the kind of opportunity that most physicians spent their entire careers hoping for. "Are you serious?" I asked because it seemed too good to be true. Completely serious. He wants to set up a call with you early next week to discuss details. But Sarah, this is it. This is the opportunity you've been working toward your entire career. I looked around my childhood home at the expensive furnishings and perfect decor that represented my family's version of success and realized that I was being offered something they'd never understood was possible. Not just a job, but recognition from the most elite medical institution in the country. Not just a salary, but financial security that would make all of my medical expenses manageable. Alina, I don't know what to say. Say you'll take the call, she said, and I could hear her smiling through the phone. Sarah, you've spent the last 5 years building toward this moment. Your research, your patient care, your dedication to advancing treatment for autoimmune disorders. Dr. Webb specifically mentioned that your work could change how we approach lupus treatment nationwide. After I hung up with Elena, I sat in the silence of my parents' living room and tried to process what had just happened. The Mayo Clinic wanted me, not just as a physician, but as a researcher and department head. They were offering me more money than I'd ever imagined earning at an institution that represented the pinnacle of medical achievement. And I was learning about it while sitting alone in a house where my own family was celebrating my brother's wedding without bothering to include me in the family photographs. The contrast was so stark, it was almost surreal. In one phone call, I'd learned that some of the most respected medical professionals in the country considered my work valuable enough to build a department around it. Meanwhile, my own family couldn't be bothered to save me a seat in the car for my brother's wedding. I looked at my phone and realized I had missed several texts while I was talking to Elena. 3 were from Jessica, sent over the past hour. The first one read, "Sarah, where are you? We're taking family photos and you're not here." The second, "I asked your mom where you were, and she said you were coming directly to the ceremony, but you're David's sister. You should be in these pictures." The third, "I'm really confused about what's happening with your family. Can you call me?" I stared at the messages and felt something shift inside me, some fundamental understanding about my place in this family's narrative. Jessica, who had known us for less than 2 years, immediately recognized that something was wrong with my absence from family photos. She understood instinctively that a sister should be included in her brother's wedding photographs. But my own parents, who had raised me and supposedly loved me, had planned an entire day of celebration without considering whether I should be present for any of the meaningful moments. I was still processing this realization when another text arrived, this one from David. "Sarah, where are you? Mom said you're coming to the ceremony, but shouldn't you be in the family photos?" Even David, who had been largely oblivious to the subtle exclusions I'd experienced over the years, was beginning to notice that something was wrong about how I was being treated. I texted back to both of them, "Looking forward to seeing you at the ceremony. Focus on celebrating your special day." It was the diplomatic response, the one that avoided conflict and allowed everyone to maintain their comfortable assumptions about our family dynamics. But as I typed the words, I felt a growing certainty that I was done protecting other people's comfort at the expense of my own dignity. The Mayo Clinic offer had crystallized something I'd been avoiding for years. I was successful, respected, and valued by people who understood what I had accomplished. The fact that my own family couldn't see my worth didn't diminish it. It just meant I'd been seeking validation from people who were fundamentally incapable of providing it. I spent the next hour getting ready for the ceremony, applying makeup and fixing my hair with more care than I'd initially planned. Not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because I was beginning to understand that how I presented myself was a form of self-respect that had nothing to do with other people's opinions. As I prepared to leave for the chapel, I caught sight of myself in the hallway mirror. I looked professional, polished, and confident. I looked like someone who had just been offered a department head position at the Mayo Clinic. I looked like someone whose research was changing how autoimmune disorders were treated nationwide. I looked like someone who deserved better than being relegated to the margins of her own brother's wedding.
The drive to the ceremony venue took me through some of Boulder's most beautiful neighborhoods, past mountain views that had been featured in countless lifestyle magazines as examples of Colorado living at its finest. The chapel itself was elegant and understated, exactly the kind of venue that would photograph beautifully and create the kind of wedding memories that could be displayed proudly for decades. I arrived at exactly 3:30, as my mother had suggested, and immediately noticed the line of luxury cars dropping off guests at the entrance. The parking area was filled with expensive vehicles, and the guests walking toward the chapel were dressed with the kind of careful elegance that suggested significant disposable income and an understanding of what constituted appropriate wedding attire. Inside the chapel was decorated with the kind of floral arrangements that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. White roses and peonies were arranged in towering displays that framed the altar, and soft lighting created the kind of romantic atmosphere that would look magical in photographs. The guests were settling into their seats, and I could see my mother's careful planning in the way the space was organized. The front rows were reserved for immediate family and the closest friends, while the back section accommodated the broader social circle that had been included in the celebration.
Assigned seat, which was indeed toward the back of the chapel, and realized that I was surrounded by people I didn't recognize. Jessica's extended family, David's college friends, my parents' neighbors and business associates, people who were connected to the couple but weren't part of the inner circle that had been deemed worthy of prominent seating. As I settled into the pew, I noticed several people looking at me with expressions of polite confusion. They were clearly trying to figure out where I fit in the wedding hierarchy, why someone who was seated so far from the family section looked familiar from the rehearsal dinner introductions. An elderly woman next to me leaned over and whispered, "Are you with the bride's family or the groom's family?" "I'm David's sister," I replied, and watched her eyebrows rise in surprise. "Oh," she said, and I could see her trying to process why the groom's sister was seated in what was clearly not the family section. How lovely. The conversation died after that, but I could feel her continuing to glance at me throughout the next few minutes, as if my presence in this particular location was a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. The ceremony began with the kind of musical accompaniment that suggested professional musicians rather than the church organist, and the processional was everything my mother had undoubtedly envisioned. Jessica looked radiant in a dress that probably cost more than I made in several months, and David looked genuinely overwhelmed with happiness as he watched her walk down the aisle. They were beautiful together, and their joy was evident and infectious. This was what weddings were supposed to be about. Two people committing to build a life together, surrounded by everyone who loved and supported them. From my seat in the back, I watched my parents in the front row, their faces glowing with pride and satisfaction. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, and my father sat with his arm around her shoulders, both of them clearly moved by the significance of the moment. It was a perfect family tableau, and I understood that my presence in the frame would have somehow diminished the symmetry of the image they were trying to create. Whatever story they were telling themselves and the world about our family, it was a story that worked better without me in it. The ceremony itself was beautiful and personal, with vows that David and Jessica had written themselves and readings that reflected their shared values and hopes for the future. The officiant spoke about the importance of family support in marriage, about how the love of parents and siblings would sustain the couple through whatever challenges they might face. As he spoke these words, I felt a profound sense of disconnection from what was happening in front of me. I was the sibling being referenced, the family member whose support was supposedly essential to this marriage's success. But I was experiencing this moment from the perspective of an outside observer rather than a participant. When the ceremony concluded and David kissed his new wife, the chapel erupted in applause and celebration. People stood and cheered, and the photographer captured the moment from multiple angles, creating the official record of this milestone in our family's history. As the recessional began and the wedding party made their way back down the aisle, David's eyes found mine in the crowd. He smiled and waved, a gesture that was clearly meant to include me in his moment of triumph.
But Jessica, walking beside him as his new wife, looked troubled. Her gaze swept the chapel, clearly searching for something, and when she spotted me in the back section, her expression shifted to what looked like confusion and concern. After the ceremony, guests moved to the reception area for cocktails and hors d'oeuvres, while the wedding party participated in more formal photography. I found myself once again in the position of being present but not included, part of the celebration but not part of the intimate moments that would be preserved in the official record of the day. I was standing near the bar, nursing a glass of champagne and making polite conversation with other guests, when Jessica appeared at my side. She had changed out of her ceremony dress into a slightly less formal but equally stunning reception gown, and she looked like the kind of bride who would grace the pages of luxury wedding magazines. "Sarah," she said, and there was something in her voice that demanded my full attention. "We need to talk." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.